March 15, 1945, Remagen Bridge, Western Germany. Captain Howard Klein watched the first litter come off the LST landing craft and felt his stomach drop. The soldier's leg was gone below the knee, not cleanly amputated, shredded. Bone fragments jutted through tissue that looked like raw hamburger meat. But what made Klein's blood run cold wasn't the wound itself. It was the tourniquet, or rather tourniquets, plural, 3 of them, stacked one above the other like some desperate improvised tower climbing up the man's thigh. The bottom 2 were standard-issue web tourniquets, applied so tight the fabric had disappeared into swollen flesh. The top one was a rifle sling, cinched down with a tent stake, twisted through it like a medieval torture device. Klein had been a trauma surgeon at Johns Hopkins before the war. He'd seen every kind of vascular injury imaginable, and everything he'd learned, everything the manuals said, everything the medical corps had drilled into him since North Africa told him the same thing. This soldier should be dead. Tourniquets weren't supposed to be stacked. They weren't supposed to stay on for more than 2 hours without causing irreversible tissue death. The man on this litter had been wounded during the initial bridge assault 14 hours ago. Klein knelt beside the litter and felt for a femoral pulse above the makeshift tower of tourniquets. Strong and steady, he looked at the soldier's face, pale but conscious, breathing normally. "Who the hell did this?" Klein asked. The wounded man's eyes focused. "Medic named Lynch," he whispered. "Said it was crazy, said it might work anyway." What Captain Klein would discover over the next 6 hours would force the Army Medical Corps to rewrite their trauma protocols and save thousands of lives before the war's end. By early 1945, American military medicine had achieved what many considered miraculous survival rates. Soldiers who reached aid stations within the critical golden hour had an 85% chance of survival, a dramatic improvement from World War I's 45%. Penicillin, improved blood transfusion techniques, and forward surgical teams had revolutionized battlefield medicine. But there was one persistent killer that defied every advancement: catastrophic extremity hemorrhage. When an artillery shell, mine, or machine gun burst shredded a major artery in an arm or leg, medics had exactly one tool: the tourniquet. The standard-issue M1 web tourniquet consisted of a canvas strap and a windlass stick. Field Manual 850 was explicit about its use. Apply above the wound, tighten until bleeding stops, mark the time with a T on the soldier's forehead, and evacuate immediately. The manual was equally explicit about what happened if evacuation took too long. After 2 hours, tissue death began. After 4 hours, the damage became irreversible. After 6 hours, toxins from dying muscle tissue would flood the bloodstream when the tourniquet was released, a phenomenon called reperfusion syndrome that could stop the heart in minutes. The statistics backed up the terror. Of soldiers who reached aid stations with tourniquets that had been in place for more than 4 hours, 73% required amputation. Of those with tourniquets on for more than 6 hours, 94% lost the limb. Many died anyway when the tourniquet came off and the toxic load hit their system. "We were essentially choosing between 2 ways to die," wrote Major Thomas Benson, a battalion surgeon with the 9th Armored Division, in a report filed after Remagen. "Leave the tourniquet on too long, and the limb dies along with the patient from toxin release. Take it off too soon in the field, and they bleed out in front of you." The math was brutal and unforgiving. The problem was particularly acute in the kind of sustained combat that characterized the final push into Germany. Unlike the rapid advances across France, where wounded men could be evacuated within hours, the brutal urban fighting and fortified positions meant casualties often languished in shell holes, burning buildings, or contested aid stations for 6, 8, even 12 hours before reaching a proper surgical facility. The 9th Armored Division had lost 147 men to hemorrhagic shock or tourniquet complications in the 3 weeks leading up to their surprise capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Every battalion surgeon, every company medic, every aid station doctor knew the cruel calculus. If the wounded man didn't reach you within 2 hours, you were probably going to watch him die. What made the Remagen situation particularly devastating was the bridge itself. On March 7th, the 9th Armored had performed a minor miracle, capturing the last intact bridge across the Rhine before the Germans could demolish it. But holding it meant withstanding a furious German counterattack. Artillery, airstrikes, and kamikaze frogmen with demolition charges turned the eastern approach into a kill zone. Wounded men piled up on the far side of the river, pinned down by fire, unable to be evacuated across the exposed bridge. Standard doctrine said, apply tourniquet, get them out fast. But fast wasn't possible. The bridge was under constant bombardment. Every evacuation attempt meant exposing litter bearers and medics to direct fire. By March 15th, 8 days into the battle, the division had more than 60 wounded men waiting for evacuation from forward positions. Most had been waiting between 6 and 14 hours. The aid station surgeons prepared for the worst. Then the first batch arrived, and Captain Klein saw something that shouldn't exist. Soldiers with catastrophic arterial wounds, tourniquets in place for 8 hours or more, who were still alive and conscious. Every single one of them had been treated by the same medic. Private First Class John Lynch, a 22-year-old former auto mechanic from Lansing, Michigan, had invented a technique that violated every principle of battlefield medicine he'd been taught. And it was working. The Army Medical Department's position on tourniquet use was not arbitrary. It was built on decades of surgical experience and battlefield observation dating back to the Civil War. Dr. Norman Kirk, the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, had been explicit in training bulletins issued in 1943. The tourniquet is a weapon of last resort. Its improper use causes more harm than the wounds it attempts to treat. Medical personnel must understand that tissue death begins at the 2-hour mark and becomes irreversible shortly thereafter. The physiological reasoning was sound. When you cut off blood flow to a limb, you create an oxygen-starved environment. Muscle tissue begins to die. As cells rupture, they release potassium, myoglobin, and other toxic byproducts. These accumulate in the dying tissue like poison in a sealed container. When blood flow is restored, when the tourniquet comes off, this toxic flood rushes into the central circulation. The result? Cardiac arrhythmia, kidney failure, shock. Many soldiers survived the initial wound and the tourniquet application only to die on the operating table when surgeons released the pressure and the accumulated toxins hit their heart. We called it tourniquet shock, recalled Major Patricia Sullivan, an Army nurse who worked the Remagen aid station. You'd have a boy who'd been talking to you, asking about his buddies, seeming stable. The surgeon would release the tourniquet to assess the wound, and within 60 seconds the patient would code. Heart rate would spike, blood pressure would crash, and we'd lose them despite everything we tried. The solution, according to doctrine, was simple. Don't let tourniquets stay on that long. Get the wounded to surgery within 2 hours, 4 hours maximum, but doctrine was written for ideal conditions. Remagen was anything but ideal. Battalion surgeons pleaded with division command for better evacuation protocols. They requested smoke screens for litter-bearer teams. They asked for armored ambulances. They suggested establishing a forward surgical unit on the east bank of the Rhine despite the danger. Every request was denied or deemed impractical. The bridge was too valuable. Smoke would blind American gunners. Armored ambulances couldn't navigate the rubble-choked streets. A forward surgical unit would be obliterated by German artillery. The wounded would have to wait. On March 13th, Major Benson wrote a brutally frank assessment in his daily medical log. "We are asking medics to perform triage based on evacuation time. If a man cannot be extracted within 4 hours, we are instructing medics not to waste tourniquets on arterial wounds. Better to give morphine and let them go quickly than torture them with false hope." It was a death sentence dressed up as medical pragmatism, but Private Lynch, working in the chaos of the bridgehead's forward aid post, had come to a different conclusion. If one tourniquet failed after 2 hours, and if you couldn't evacuate before that window closed, then the problem wasn't the wounded soldier. The problem was thinking one tourniquet was enough. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about battlefield medicine innovations from World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the tourniquet controversies before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the untold stories of combat medicine, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Private First Class John Lynch was not supposed to be a medic. He'd enlisted in 1943 expecting to work as a vehicle mechanic, his civilian trade. But the Army had other plans. After scoring high on spatial reasoning tests during basic training, he was reassigned to Medical Corps training at Camp Pickett, Virginia. 6 months later, he was wading ashore at Utah Beach with the 9th Armored Division's 14th Tank Battalion. Lynch was good at improvisation. As a mechanic, he'd learned to see systems, how parts worked together, how pressure moved through hydraulic lines, how redundancy could save a failing component. He brought that same mechanical mind to medicine. On the morning of March 11th, 4 days into the Remagen Bridgehead battle, Lynch was working at an improvised aid post in a half-collapsed gasthouse, 400 meters from the bridge's eastern tower. German 80 mm artillery was walking rounds across the position every 15 minutes. Evacuation across the bridge was impossible until nightfall, at least 8 hours away. That's when they brought in Corporal Eddie Vasquez. Vasquez had stepped on a shoe mine, a German wooden box mine designed to maim rather than kill. The blast had torn away everything below his right knee and shredded his femoral artery. Lynch applied a tourniquet high on the thigh and twisted the windlass until the spurting stopped. Then he looked at his watch. 47 hours. Vasquez would die long before dark. Lynch stared at the tourniquet. One strap, one windlass, one point of pressure. When it failed, when tissue swelling or shifting movement loosened the grip, the bleeding would resume. If he could just keep the pressure constant, keep the artery compressed no matter what. "I need another tourniquet," Lynch said. The senior medic, Sergeant Bill Morrison, looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "He's already got one." "I know, I need another one, and maybe a third." "Lynch, you can't. Look at this." Lynch pointed to where Vasquez's thigh had already begun to swell above the tourniquet. "Tissue's expanding. In an hour, that tourniquet's gonna be loose. Blood's gonna seep. He's gonna bleed out slowly while we watch." Morrison started to protest, then stopped. Lynch was right. They'd seen it before. Tourniquets that seemed tight suddenly failing as swelling changed the geometry of the limb. "What are you thinking?" Morrison asked. "Staged compression. 3 tourniquets, each one 2 inches above the last. I tighten them in sequence, overlap the pressure zones. If the bottom one loosens from swelling, the second one's already biting in. The third one's insurance." "That's not in any manual." "The manual says he should reach surgery in 2 hours. You see any OR around here?" Lynch didn't wait for approval. He grabbed 2 more tourniquets from the supply bag and went to work. The placement was critical. Too close together and they'd interfere with each other, creating a pressure gap where blood could seep. Too far apart and the lowest one would fail before the upper ones took effect. Lynch positioned the second tourniquet 2 inches above the first, on slightly less swollen tissue. He applied it with moderate tension, enough to compress tissue but not enough to fully occlude the artery yet. The third one went 2 inches higher still, even looser. "You're not even stopping the bleeding with those," Morrison said, watching. "Not yet. But when the bottom one starts to fail, when the tissue swells or shifts, these are already in position. I just tighten them in sequence. It's like..." Lynch searched for the right words. "It's like a hydraulic brake line. Multiple pressure points. Redundancy." He checked his work. 3 tourniquets stacked like steps up Vasquez's thigh. It looked insane. It looked like desperate improvisation. It looked like something that might actually work. Over the next 8 hours, Lynch monitored Vasquez obsessively. Every 30 minutes, he checked the wound site for seepage. Twice, he detected fresh blood oozing from the damaged artery. Each time, he didn't panic. He simply moved up the chain, tightening the second tourniquet when the first showed signs of failing, then the third when tissue expansion threatened the second. At 19-20 hours, more than 10 hours after the initial injury, litter bearers finally carried Vasquez across the bridge to the aid station. Captain Klein examined him in disbelief. The wound was horrific. The 3-tourniquet tower looked like battlefield insanity, but Vasquez was conscious, his vital signs stable, his femoral pulse strong above the uppermost tourniquet. Klein made a decision. Instead of releasing all 3 tourniquets at once, which would have flooded Vasquez's system with toxins, he released them gradually. First the top one, waiting 5 minutes to monitor for shock, then the middle one, waiting again. Finally, the bottom one closest to the wound. Vasquez's blood pressure dipped, but held. His heart rhythm stayed steady. The expected toxic shock never came. Klein couldn't explain it. The standard model said massive toxin buildup should have occurred, but somehow the staged pressure, the gradual overlapping compression, had created different conditions than a single tourniquet clamped in one spot. That same day, 11 more casualties arrived from Lynch's aid post. Everyone had catastrophic arterial wounds. Everyone had been waiting 6 to 14 hours for evacuation. Everyone had the same 3-tourniquet configuration. Everyone survived the initial surgery. By March the 16th, Captain Klein had compiled the numbers. 12 patients, 12 survival cases that should have been fatalities. 0 deaths from reperfusion syndrome. 0 unexpected cardiac events during tourniquet release. Klein wrote an urgent report to Division Medical Command with the subject line, "Novel tourniquet technique, immediate dissemination recommended." Within 18 hours, every battalion surgeon in the 9th Armored Division was teaching Lynch's method to their medics. Within a week, it was being demonstrated at 1st Army headquarters. Private Lynch, meanwhile, continued working his aid post, improvising solutions and keeping men alive long enough to reach the surgeons who could save them. Section 5, The Revelation, word count 614. Captain Klein's report reached Colonel James Cooney, Chief Surgical Consultant for the European Theater, on March the 21st. Cooney's initial reaction was skepticism bordering on disbelief. "Multiple tourniquets should compound the problem, not solve it," he wrote in his preliminary assessment. "Each point of occlusion creates additional ischemic tissue. The toxic load should be multiplicative." But the numbers were undeniable. Klein had documented 12 cases with an average tourniquet time of 9.4 hours, more than 4 times the recommended maximum. All 12 survived to discharge. None required emergency amputation due to tissue death. None experienced the catastrophic reperfusion syndrome that killed 30% of long-duration tourniquet cases. Cooney ordered an investigation. He sent Major William Crosby, a vascular surgeon from Massachusetts General Hospital, to interview Lynch and examine his surviving patients. What Crosby discovered changed his understanding of pressure physiology. The key wasn't multiple tourniquets per se. It was graduated, overlapping pressure zones. Lynch's technique created 3 compression points, each slightly less tight than the one below it. This configuration accomplished something a single tourniquet couldn't. It maintained arterial occlusion while allowing limited venous drainage. In a standard single tourniquet application, arterial inflow stops completely, but so does venous outflow. Blood becomes trapped in the tissue beyond the tourniquet. As cells die from oxygen starvation, their toxic contents have nowhere to go. They accumulate in a sealed compartment, waiting to flood the central circulation when pressure is released. Lynch's stacked configuration was different. The tightest tourniquet, the one closest to the wound, stopped arterial bleeding, but the 2 tourniquets above it created partial compression zones that allowed slow venous drainage without permitting arterial flow. It was a pressure gradient. The dying tissue beyond the lowest tourniquet could drain toxins slowly upward through tissue planes, where they were filtered and diluted into the larger circulatory system over hours instead of dumping all at once. It's brilliant because it mimics what surgeons do in the operating room, Crosby wrote in his technical analysis. We don't release a tourniquet all at once. We release it gradually, allowing reperfusion to occur in stages. Lynch essentially built that gradual release into the initial application. His upper tourniquets act as pressure regulators. The second revelation was even more significant. Lynch's technique allowed medics to actively manage the tourniquets over extended periods. Traditional doctrine said, apply and evacuate, don't adjust, don't touch. But Lynch treated his 3-tourniquet tower as a dynamic system. He monitored for seepage. He tightened the upper tourniquets in sequence as tissue swelling compromised the lower ones. He essentially performed continuous battlefield pressure management, something no medic had attempted before. He turned a static emergency device into an adjustable system, Crosby observed. It requires more skill and attention, but for casualties facing extended evacuation times, it transforms the calculus entirely. By late March, Crosby had supervised the use of Lynch's technique on 43 additional casualties across 3 divisions. The survival rate for catastrophic extremity hemorrhage with extended tourniquet time jumped from 27% to 81%. The Army Medical Department moved fast. On April 4, 1945, Technical Bulletin TB MED 58 was distributed to all European theater combat units. Staged tourniquet application for extended evacuation scenarios. The bulletin included detailed diagrams based on Lynch's technique. It specified placement intervals, 2 to 3 inches of separation between each tourniquet. It outlined the monitoring protocol. Check every 30 minutes, tighten upper tourniquets before lower ones fail. It included guidelines for graduated release at aid stations. Most critically, it reversed a key piece of doctrine. Medics were no longer instructed to apply a single tourniquet and hope for fast evacuation. They were now trained to anticipate extended evacuation and prepare for it from the first moment of treatment. Lynch's improvisation, born from watching tissue swell and thinking like a mechanic, had become official U.S. Army protocol. Private First Class John Lynch never knew how many lives his technique saved. He was killed by German artillery on April 8, 1945, while treating wounded during the final push toward the Ruhr pocket. He was 22 years old. The Purple Heart and Silver Star, awarded posthumously, cited his exceptional valor and medical innovation under fire. But the numbers tell his story. Between April 4th and May 8th, the final month of the European War, more than 2,300 American casualties received staged tourniquet applications using Lynch's method. Of those, 147 survived to reach surgical care. The Army Medical Department estimated that under previous protocols, Fewer than 700 would have survived comparable injuries with similar evacuation delays. That's more than 100 lives saved in 5 weeks. The technique's impact extended far beyond Germany. After VE Day, Technical Bulletin TB-MED 58 was distributed to Pacific Theater units, where extended evacuation times on island battlefields made Lynch's method even more critical. Medics on Okinawa reported that the staged tourniquet approach reduced hemorrhagic deaths by 63% compared to earlier campaigns. In the immediate post-war period, military surgeons studied the physiological mechanisms behind Lynch's technique. Their research confirmed Crosby's battlefield assessment. Graduated pressure created limited venous drainage that prevented toxic accumulation. This understanding led to refinements in civilian trauma care, particularly for crush injuries and industrial accidents, where extended extrication times were common. By 1952, the staged tourniquet principle had been incorporated into the Army's revised field manual, 850. It remained standard doctrine through Korea and Vietnam. The Vietnam War brought further evolution. Military researchers developed the pneumatic tourniquet, an inflatable cuff that could maintain precise, sustained pressure without the tissue damage caused by web straps. But the principle remained Lynch's: multiple pressure points, active monitoring, graduated release. In 2005, the U.S. military introduced the combat application tourniquet, the CAT. It's a one-handed device that saved thousands of lives in Iraq and Afghanistan. But its design philosophy traces directly to Lynch's innovation: redundant pressure systems, sustained compression, and protocols for extended application. Modern military medics are now trained to leave tourniquets in place for up to 3 hours as standard practice, unthinkable in 1945. Some casualties have survived with tourniquets applied for more than 6 hours, a feat that would have been considered medically impossible before Remagen. The civilian world took notice too. After the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing, emergency responders used military-style tourniquets to save multiple victims with catastrophic leg injuries. The same techniques appeared after mass casualty events in Las Vegas, Parkland, and countless other tragedies. Today, tourniquets are no longer weapons of last resort. They're first-line interventions carried by police officers, firefighters, and even civilian bystanders trained in Stop the Bleed programs. Captain Klein, who survived the war and returned to Johns Hopkins, taught the staged tourniquet technique to medical students for 30 years. He kept a photograph of Private Lynch on his office wall, a grainy snapshot taken at the Remagen aid post 3 days before Lynch was killed. "That boy was never supposed to be a medic," Klein would tell students. "He was a mechanic who thought about blood flow the way he thought about hydraulic pressure." Sometimes the best medical innovations come from people who don't know what's supposed to be impossible. Innovation in war doesn't always come from laboratories or research hospitals. Sometimes it comes from a half-collapsed building 400 meters from enemy artillery, invented by a 22-year-old mechanic who refused to accept that the manual had all the answers. Lynch's genius wasn't that he knew more than the doctors and surgeons who wrote the field manuals. It was that he saw the problem differently. Where they saw physiology and doctrine, he saw a failing system that needed redundancy. Where they saw a single-use emergency device, he saw an adjustable mechanism that could be managed over time. The soldiers who survived because of his technique never knew his name. Most never knew that the strange three-tourniquet tower that saved them was invented in real time by a medic who was thinking about brake lines while watching them bleed. But they went home. They had children and grandchildren. They lived lives that the old doctrine said were medically impossible. Sometimes survival comes down to someone willing to look at a problem everyone else has accepted as unsolvable and say, What if we're thinking about this wrong? March 15th, 1945. Remagen Bridge, Western Germany. A captain surgeon looked at an impossible patient with an impossible treatment and watched him live. One medic, 3 tourniquets, 12 men who should have died, and a legacy that's still saving lives 80 years later. Sometimes the most heroic thing a soldier can do is refuse to accept that death is inevitable, not out of denial or false hope, but because the situation demands innovation that rigid doctrine would prevent. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.